Hello people, welcome to a brand new piece of content on my YouTube channel, and this time we're going to look at F1 2020 and how to get the best out of the setup on your car. It's of course imperative you understand the basic fundamentals of how car setup works. Fortunately for you guys, I did a setup series on F1 2019, the previous game, which you can go and check out in the card above. It's probably worth checking out if you're not fully clued up on what does what. Well, the most obvious thing that became apparent literally minutes after playing the game for the first time is that F1 2020 is inherently more understeery compared with F1 2019. So the main goal with any setup compared with the default setup is to make the car turn or rotate more. Obviously in F1 2020 they've introduced asymmetrical tyre pressures, but to be honest, that's all I'm going to say about it because there's absolutely nothing to be found by exploiting this area. So basically keep those tyre pressures nice and symmetrical. So in F1 2020 you can go over the curbs a lot more than you could in the last game, which means you can use stiffer suspension and roll bar settings. So in this game, and it's definitely a game, not a sim, just remember that, there are some generalistic things you need to do to the setup whatever track you're at. So here they are. So the first thing is a very simple one. Keep all the tyre pressures on this game to a minimum. The tyres on this game don't struggle to generate any heat, quite the opposite. The limitation is trying to cool them down. So keeping the tyres on the lowest pressure possible is an important way to achieve that. Now, going back to my previous point about the cars being insanely understeery, there's a pretty straightforward way to reduce that understeer in the suspension. Effectively have the ethos of softening the front suspension and roll bar and stiffening the rear. This is why you might see a lot of the guys at the top of the leaderboards with 111 suspension and roll bars. It's a good starting point to get the car to comply without heaps of understeer. Running the suspension that aggressive, you'll need to compensate a little bit with the wings you run. Running a lower front wing setting compared with the rear is very common as the car is already pretty responsive because of the suspension settings being used, so there's no need to run a large amount of front wing. The bonus with that is that you'll be quicker on the straights with less drag coming into the equation. So the on-throttle transmission should pretty much be on 50 the whole time as it keeps those rear tyre temps under control. The off-throttle diff, however, is where you can make a big change to the feeling of the setup. Running a lower value here allows the car to turn in more, but if you want a more in-depth explanation on this, then check out the video I did on this topic from last year in the card above. But you'll pretty much adjust this value between 50 and 55 on this game depending on the track and what the rest of your setup feels like. The brakes should always be at 100% on the pressure and 50% on the bias. There's nothing to be gained otherwise, and for whatever reason on this game the cars love to lock up the front axle under braking, so running the brake settings like this limits the amount of times this can happen. Finally, I always leave the geometry settings until last. I use these settings to fine tune the car to give it the exact feeling I want. Again, check out the above video on these 4 settings to get a better understanding of what they do, but generally these can differ depending on the track and the rest of your setup. So I won't say there's a right or wrong here as such, but I'd say it's just important you understand what they do so you get the feeling you want. The track surface at every track differs, so although your setup may feel completely hooked up at Zandvoort, if you take it to Silverstone it may be a bit all over the place. These differences can also have a huge effect on tyre temperature, hence why it's very easy to overheat your tyres at a track like China, but at Monza it's quite the opposite. Factors such as elevation change, bumps, corner types and curbs all contribute to each track being and feeling a little bit different. Also, depending on the track, different compounds of tyres are used, like in real life F1. This can change the feeling you get from the car, and naturally a different setup needs to be used to get the most from that different compound of tyre. Some tracks may use the C4 soft tyre for example, whereas other tracks may enforce a softer or harder version of that soft tyre. Confused yet? Well, that also goes for the medium and hard compounds as well. So although there are fundamentals on how to set up the car on this game, each track is a little bit different. So your best bet is to go to time trial on the leaderboards, go to the top, nick a legit F1 Esports driver's setup that's set the quickest time. Don't nick a hacker's one by accident. I don't know why so many people hack this game, it's absolutely insane. But just bear in mind the time trial physics are slightly different to that of the online physics. So naturally, most of the time, setups will differ slightly between qualifying and the race. The key thing here, and this is the case on any sim or game and in real life, is to make the setup more aggressive for quali, as you haven't got to worry about tyre degradation and management like you do in the race. These are only little tweaks, you don't want to change the entire philosophy of the setup, but a few things I generally do are add a click more of front wing, minus a click of rear wing, minus a click of off throttle differential, minus a click of front suspension or front roll bar, add a click more of rear suspension or rear roll bar, add some front toe, minus some rear toe, add some front camber, minus some rear camber. Now, don't do all of them at exactly the same time, but they all have the same thing in mind, which is to make the setup a little bit more aggressive. Another general thing, in quali compared with the race, using slightly higher wings is a viable option. This will allow you to get the most from the new tyre in the corners in quali trim. In the race, it's very important to minimise the amount of wings you're using, because the higher wings you use, the quicker you'll eat through your ERS, which is a massive negative. It'll also make overtaking and defending easier too, as long as you're half decent in the corners. Now, every driver is a bit different, and I've wasted a lot of hours trying to drive someone else's setup because they're fast with it, but ultimately you need to feel 100% comfortable with the setup underneath you to extract the most from yourself. Again, this is a general thing in any form of racing. Some drivers prefer a front limited car which is understeery, others prefer a rear limited car which is oversteery, and don't be afraid to make some changes to a setup you've been given or found to make it suit you. Trust your instincts and the feeling you're getting and make the changes accordingly. So I'm thinking of doing a members only video which will contain a setup for every track on the game, which is pretty decent, might come in handy for a league race or something like that. If you think it's a good idea, mention in the comments below, but don't forget to become a member as well, so if that does happen, you won't miss out. Well, I think that's it for this video, and don't get me wrong, there's a fair amount of generalisation in the video. Setting up a car in F1 2020 and on any game and sim is a dark art, but I hope this video at the very least gave you somewhere to start. And one more thing before I go, I'm thinking of making a wet setup video very similar to this, can go a bit more in depth into it. If that's something you want to see, please let me know in the comments below. But as always, if you liked the video, thumbs up, sub up to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this. But I guess until the next video, I'll see you soon.